Loane Sharp is from the Free Market Foundation, and he's been looking into the possible effects of privatisation in South Africa, and he comes in now to talk about the context and the conclusions. Morning, Loane. This is, I think, the first time we've talked to you since you moved to the Free Market Foundation from AdCorp. And how's it going there? I would think you are freer, not that you weren't free at AdCorp, to push the free market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Richard was an incredible supporter at AdCorp, and he continues to support the Free Market Foundation's work. But the labour market is not quite in the state of flux that it was 4 years ago. And there are bigger issues, in fact, black economic advancement and so on. These issues, privatisation, consumer rights, there's a full-scale governmental attack on all of those issues. And I'm delighted to be at the foundation.
All right, well, let's look at, there are lots of things to talk about. Let's take one particular hook. The Finance Minister hinting a couple of times now, and I think seeing what will happen as a result of those hints, of privatisation of state assets in order to get money to do things, because they've run out of money. So what's the context that we're working in here?
Well, look, the Minister of Finance and all Ministers of Finance since Derek Keys have spoken to the audience they're speaking to. So I don't think we can take from the Minister of Finance's midterm budget policy statement any indication of governmental policy. In fact, government is moving in the opposite direction. It's becoming more and more invasive and intrusive in the lives of consumers, corporations and others. So I'm not convinced that the Minister of Finance means what he says when he says they're looking at the portfolio of state-owned enterprises. And I think we really should be pushing the Treasury in particular on the privatisation issue. There's no way government should be involved in any of the state-owned enterprises that it's involved in as a shareholder, as an owner. We know that ownership of assets is crucial to the way that those resources are utilised. And government has been a spectacular failure as an owner, as a shareholder. It's ridiculous, for example, to protect 70,000 workers in the taxi industry at the expense of 11 million consumers or commuters. And government is making this ridiculous calculus because of its partnership with COSATU. So they're very exciting developments. COSATU's implosion, which I think will be permanent, and also more and more a lack of fiscal space. But the minister was obviously talking to the rating agencies. He wasn't talking to any serious change in ideology within government.
Loane, just having a look at your article, you talk about privatisation being an attractive option for South Africa. Would you say that this could possibly put an end to all of South Africa's problems?
Well, I think my calculations are that if you privatised all state-owned enterprises and you privatised public services in municipalities in particular that should really be private, you would raise about R1.5 trillion over a 3 to 4 year period, and that money distributed to the general population would put in the hands of each South African household about 169,000 Rand in cash. That money could be used by the working class to move into the middle class by buying homes, or putting down a deposit on a home, or perhaps financing their children's education or something like that. My calculations are that with that 169,000 Rand voucher or cash, the black middle class will swell from 5.9 million to 11.2 million over a very short period of time. And that brings us into the problem of the ANC. Does the ANC represent the working class, or does it represent the middle class? And we saw in May's election earlier this year that the working class is dwindling. I mean, there are now 5 million people employed as blue-collar workers, which COSATU traditionally represents, and there are 10 million people who are white-collar workers. So the calculus has changed dramatically, and that's why the ANC nearly lost Gauteng.
Imagine if they positioned privatisation not as saying the government will get the money, but the people will get the money. You could argue that the people are the shareholders of state-owned enterprises, not the government. They love to talk about themselves as the shareholder. But you've got a graph on government investment, and let's put that up and have a look at it so that we can see. Now, what's that telling us?
Well, Well, government investment in 1966 was 40% of South Africa's total investment by the private sector.
That's
and the public
in what
sector.
sort of things?
So that was investment in infrastructure supporting the discovery of gold in the Free State goldfields. It was production of new homes. It was also things like new railway lines, new transport.
So what's that one telling us then?
So that's telling us that government is investing less and less and less in the population. And you might think that government should be investing less, but the flip side of this is that government is consuming more. So instead of investing, they're consuming more. And you can see here that government consumption as a percentage of GDP has gone up from about 12% to about 23% over the last few decades. The crucial thing here is that 88% of government spending today is made up of compensation of employees. So government consumption is primarily directed at swelling the civil service.
Remember we had Professor Yanni Rousseau, who was at the Reserve Bank, now at Wits, came in. I want to just mention his number to you, which I think was 54% of the wage, of government's expenditure is on wages. His figure was that by 2026, the wage bill plus the social grants will consume all of government revenue.
Well, 76% of all the taxes collected from people earning 500,000 or more per annum, 76% of those taxes is paid out in social grants. It's not sustainable. 4% of income taxpayers pay 41% of all income taxes. So we have an incredible fiscal burden on people, on a very small number of people. And government's trying to massage those figures. So SARS decided unilaterally that everybody who's employed, whether they're earning an income or paying taxes, now needs to receive an IRP5. Which swelled the apparent number of taxpayers from 3.8 to 12.5 million. But that was a pure marketing exercise because the government was being criticized for how few taxpayers are paying so much of the taxes.
But most of those with IRP5s are still not paying tax.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 2/3 of them, at least, are not paying tax. So the question here is an ideological one, and how you transform government's ideology into privatisation. And I think the right angle is to appeal to the black middle class. The ANC really has a choice. Do they continue to support the dwindling working class, or do they support the burgeoning middle class among blacks? And I think there are tremendous parallels. This evening I'm giving a talk at the foundation around what was happening to the black middle class in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, and where would the black middle class be today if we didn't have this 50-year experiment with apartheid?
Loane, I just want to jump in there because there's something that I really want to know. Obviously now what you are saying is that with privatization there will be greater efficiencies. Now private companies need to make sure that they make money. So what would happen to making sure that they are still able to give a greater service to the community? And I'll give you an example that was probably used in a lot of the textbooks with, you know, a bus route that was being used and now taken over by a private company. It's not as lucrative, so it's being taken away. How sure are we that the greater society will be able to benefit from privatization of these assets?
It's a critical question. You know, how do you, if you have legitimate aims in terms of reducing poverty and so on, how do you pursue those aims if the private sector is more in control? My answer would be that there is a kind of de facto privatization occurring. Last year, enrollments at low-fee private schools shot up 27%, and enrollments at government schools fell by 6%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there are over 12 million people in the schooling system. So these low-fee private schools are expanding at an extraordinary rate, and government schools are closing down. Another example, there are now 550,000 policemen and women on the beat, but there are 900,000 private security guards. What we're seeing is the hollowing out of the state and its provision of services. The state has now become run by trade unions whose interest is keeping members in employment. The question is, How do you ensure that the state is operating under a better motive, like the profit motive, rather than the interests of civil servants?
Loane, we'll have to leave it at that for today, but thanks so much. That was Loane Sharp. He's from the Free Market Foundation.